So we're going to begin our exploration by asking what a nervous system is in the first place. How does it fit into the economy of the body? And we can learn a certain amount by comparing nervous systems across animals. Animals have very different capacities, very different kinds of animals. And we can also examine the evolutionary record, because when life first evolved, it didn't have nervous systems. In fact, it consisted for a couple of billion years of single-celled organisms. But eventually multicellularity came to pass, and then some animals developed nervous systems. And the closest animal that's alive today to the animals that emerged at that time with the first nervous systems is the jellyfish. Jellyfish and comb jellies. They are, of course, contemporary animals. They are not the same as the animals that evolved, however long ago, about 1 billion years ago. But from the fossil record, we can tell that these have not dissimilar body types. And when nervous systems appear, they appear not as brains, not as any kind of central nervous system, but as a distributed nerve net, distributed throughout the body of the jellyfish. And this gives it the capacity to move its body as a whole, which produces that well-known pulsing movement of the jellyfish. And that allows it to locomote. Once this happens, so the entire evolutionary scene is changed, because if you can locomote, then the whole game of predation and prey arises. Some animals can chase other animals, and so you have to be able to either chase or get away from animals. These are animals proper now. But of course, this body type is terribly simple compared to ours. And an important distinction is that these first nervous systems evolved in animals which were radially symmetric. They've got round bodies. Most of the interesting animals that are going to arise afterwards come after a later period of evolution in which bodies become tube-like, and they have lateral symmetry, so you can distinguish a left and a right. There's no left and a right on a jellyfish. And they evolve in very, very diverse ways, leading to very radically different kinds of animals. It's hard to get to an animal that's more different from the human than the octopus. But octopuses, who we know or recognize as being incredibly clever in a vague sense, not intelligent in the sense of doing mathematics and playing chess, but intelligent in the sense of solving lots of problems, having very complex adaptive behavior, being able to respond in differentiated ways to circumstances. Octopuses are very far removed from humans, and their nervous system looks nothing like a human system in its principal parts. They do have a central brain, but they have sort of 8 other little brains in their arms. So as nervous systems begin to get more complicated, we get the formation of what are called here mini brains or ganglia, which are just bunches of nerve cells or neurons, all grouped together so that most neurons connect only to other neurons. In a distributed nerve net, all the nerves are really in close contact with the rest of the body. But when you get ganglia and brains, then you have a bunch of nerves whose only universe is other nerves. And this introduces a certain disconnect between the sensory surfaces and the movement of the organism. So the evolution of nervous systems happens in many ways, and as it does so, it allows entirely new forms of bodies to appear. And these bodies can coordinate behavior in a largely unpredictable world. If you don't have a nervous system, your world better be pretty tame, because you can't really do much in it. Another thing that happens progressively and in very different ways is that some areas on the surface of the animal become sensitive to particular forms of energy. And so we develop receptor clusters, and that's going to give rise to various forms of sensation, as we saw when we studied human perception. And then you're going to get these clumps. Now, some animals have no brain, but they have many ganglia. Some animals have a brain and little in the way of ganglia. But the brain is nothing really more than a majorly big centralized ganglion. And this, for animals with brains, this introduces a great deal of complexity into their potential behavior. If we move up to the mammals then, what we find are that mammal brains all share a common architecture. They don't share it with the octopus, but all mammals, from the mouse up to the human, share a common architecture with a common stem, with deep brain structures called the basal ganglia, and with a cortex out over the surface of it. So our brains are not particularly different from other animal brains. They're a variation on a theme. And when we look at those animals who we are closest to in terms of genetic descent, those are the great apes, we find we have almost identical brains. That's not too surprising given that we have almost identical genomes as well. But if we consider just those 4 other great apes apart from the human, the gorillas, the chimpanzees, the bonobo, and the orangutan, those are the great apes, and we belong in there too, then there's no cell type and there's no structure that's found in the human brain that's not also found in their brains. So you won't find any cell type or any major structure that's not preserved across all the great apes. That's kind of astonishing, especially as we say, if we wish to see the brain as a mirror to the soul, we better watch out because we're going to look pretty chimpanzee-like. We do have a weird anatomical feature, which is that our frontal lobes are particularly enlarged even compared to our nearest neighbors. But otherwise, a human brain is just another great ape brain. But there is one cell type that's found in the great apes, and that's not found in the other primates. So primates are our lineage, and within the primates, we can identify the monkeys, and from the monkeys we also get the apes, and from the apes we get the great apes. And there is one cell type that's found in the great apes, but not in the monkeys. And these were discovered in 1929 by a chap called von Economo, great name. But they're also known as spindle cell neurons, Economo neurons or spindle cell neurons. And they didn't attract a lot of attention at the time. They're just kind of an oddity. Shown on the slide there are 2 cells that you might find in the frontal-orbital cortex of a human or a great ape. On the right is the pyramidal cell, and the cortex is absolutely stuffed with these. We've loads and loads of them, and people who study cells are very familiar with them. The spindle cell on the left has a different structure. Its cell body is different. The nucleus is not at one end, it's in the middle, and it has parts that split up. If you're good with cells, you can tell a spindle cell by looking at it. It's different because it has a different shape and form. We don't find them throughout the brain. We find them in the anterior cingulate cortex and the base of the frontal lobes, just above the eye socket. So that orbital gyrus that we saw in a previous video. Now, when it comes to interpreting the brain, in this module I'm going to be super cautious. There's part of the brain, one of these parts is called the anterior cingulate cortex, and you'll find people talking about these deep and mysterious parts of the brain as if we knew what they were. And you'll find this sometimes called part of the social brain. That's very, very poor science to call it the social brain. It explains nothing and throws mud in the water. But there's something to it, as we'll see now in just a minute. And notice that cells can be distinguished in many ways, and later on we'll meet a kind of cell that attracted some interest a few years ago called a mirror neuron. Mirror neurons do not stand out because they have a different shape or form. There's other ways to identify them that we'll get on. But these von Economo neurons or spindle cell neurons have a distinctive shape, so they're defined with respect to morphology or anatomy. And that's always a much safer distinction than to distinguish cells based on what you think their function is. So although these cells are found in the 5 great apes, they're not found with equal density in the 5 great apes. Orangutans have the fewest, gorillas have slightly more, chimpanzees and bonobos have a lot of them, and humans have a great deal more. So we are interested in these in that they seem to belong to our great ape lineage, and there are differences among the great apes, but they separate us from the monkeys. But then something happened. About 10 years ago, these same cells were found in the brain of a female humpback whale. And since then, in a few other whales, porpoises, and dolphins, cetaceans as we call them. This was a female humpbacked whale. Now, they're not monkeys or apes. They lie somewhere completely different in the line of descent, and they live in the ocean. And the whales. So this is very strange indeed. What we seem to be dealing with here is a case of what's known as convergent evolution. Whenever we meet convergent evolution, we're very, very interested in it. As a simple example, eyes have evolved several times independently in different lineages. So the insect eye has no commonality from an evolutionary point of view with the mammalian eye. But we can kind of understand why eyes are the kind of thing that would evolve, because there's an awful lot of information available in the ambient light. And any animal that can take advantage of that is going to have one up on the other animals. So there's a reason for convergence in that case. What is the problem that these cells help to solve? I've labeled it there as social, which I'm coming back to that question of the social brain, which is a lousy way to talk about the brain. But there's something going on here, because lo and behold, they were found again in elephants. Now what's going on? So we found something that seemed to be unique to our neck of the primate woods, the great apes. We got these and the monkeys don't. Good for us. But now they're also in whales and they're also in elephants. There is something very important we can learn here, and we're still learning this. And we're used to thinking in terms of evolutionary descent. We tend to think we're more similar to those animals with whom we share the most genetic material. But our social lives, our form of living in groups, tribes, packs, swarms, these are not dictated by our DNA, but they also have consequences for the body. The environment we live in is not dictated by our DNA, but it also has consequences for the body. We can see environmental influences very clearly here, for example. These animals are all small little mouse-like creatures, and they're found in deserts. But they are essentially unrelated to each other. That is, their forefathers look more dissimilar than any of these do. And yet they all sort of converge to almost the same form. You can see they've all got small, roundy bodies. They've all got those nice hopping feet. They all live in burrows. They're nocturnal. They look very similar. And these are from Australia, North America, Africa, and Asia. So there's a list of their characteristics: small rounded body shape, large hind legs, long thin tails, bipedal hop, nocturnal. They all look almost identical, even though they are not closely related by DNA. And they look so because of the environments they live in. The desert places harsh conditions on survival, and there are certain traits that you might evolve that are going to be useful there. Ways of dealing with the extreme heat, for example. And so it's to the environment we turn when we try to find out why these animals are simple. And as I said, we're used to thinking of ourselves in terms of genetic descent. That is, we see the chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, and orangutans as our nearest neighbors. But that's only a small part of the story. We're here seeing convergent evolution in whales, elephants, and humans. Now, this is obviously not directly as a result of environmental pressures. The ocean looks nothing like where elephants live, which looks nothing like where humans live. So it's not the environment. But coming back to the idea of sociality, what we do see is that the form of life of whales and the form of life of elephants includes intense social bonding, includes a great deal of care for others. Elephants mourn other elephants. They even take care of the dead, in a sense. The female humpback whales work cooperatively to raise their young. They work in very, very tight organizations. They have forms of social organization which are quite different, for example, from fish. So brains can teach us something here. And as we go along, if we're confident that we know who, where, and what we are, we tend to project that onto the brain and look for evidence that will produce us. But if we're not so sure who and what we are, the brain can speak back to us. Here's the brain telling us, look for commonalities look for whatever it is that you share with the humpback whales and the elephants, because that has relevance to stuff we find in your brain.